That was Young and Free with Alive. You're on 94.9. It is 14 minutes past 4. And it's that time of day for Creation Ministries International, where you can send your questions in. Just send them through to our text line 0401 949 949. And today, speaking to us from Creation Ministries International is Michael Cook from New Zealand. Michael, who is sort of an expert in electronics. Is that fair to say, Michael?
Oh, thank you, Mick. Yes, it's great to be back with you again and your listeners across the ditch in Australia. Yes, I am an electronics engineer, so I'm one of these nerdy types. I work in environmental monitoring systems, hardware and software, and Water New South Wales actually use our system, so I have a connection to New South Wales. So I'm an engineer, not a scientist, but I have a good understanding of earth science and hydrology, sedimentation and so on as well, which I really enjoy.
Yeah, I'm sure. I guess sort of that link that you have with governments and with both, I guess, software, hardware, that helps them sort of monitor the environment. I'm assuming that's what sort of monitoring is it?
Most of it's actually environmental monitoring of what they call basically surface and groundwater, so it's uncontained things like streams and groundwater and so on, but also there is an aspect of like reservoirs and bores and that sort of thing as well. So air quality, there's lots of different things we do for government authorities around the world actually, and yeah, so anything to do with measuring the environment, tide levels and quality of air, etc. So it's certainly an interesting field to be part of.
Yeah, and I guess you say bores. I had a question over the weekend from a friend who was I was talking to him about, you know, the groundwater that was sort of in the earth before Noah's flood, and he had a few issues with the amount of water down there. Have you ever looked at that?
Well, it's amazing how much contained water there is still after the flood and even before. The groundwater and deep water is actually quite considerable. Some of it is locked up within rocks, it's hydrates and so on, but also, for example, the Great Artesian Basin in Australia, they talk about that no longer being sort of a renewable resource. They're actually mining the water because it's really residual water from the flood contained within those gravels and
really?
Sand. So yeah, but there's certainly a large amount of the water during the flood that talks about coming up from the fountains of the Great Deep. So rainfall was certainly a contributor, but there's by far the greatest amount of water was really from subterranean sources, from steam, volcanic activity, and upwelling of groundwater and so on. So there's a lot of water. We're on a very wet planet.
Yeah, you say mining of the water. Does that mean we're using it like a resource and it will eventually run out?
That's right. Apparently, I don't know the exact. There's obviously percolation going back in, but overall the abstraction of it is eventually, it is a finite resource, I think. So the recharge, depending on the abstraction rate, it potentially is a limited resource. Hence, they're looking at managing it well.
Wow.
Interestingly, to mention, the people say about the flood, it's a good question. Well, if the flood was real, as outlined in the Bible, 3 whole chapters of Genesis talk about the flood. It's a major event that defines history. Wiping out all the land animals that breathe through the nostril and all the humans, except for 8, and then, of course, resurface the whole of the earth. If that was a real event, we should see evidence all around the world. But people say, well, where did the water come from? Where's it all gone? Surely Mount Everest couldn't have been covered by all the water. Well, we've got some great resources on creation.com about the flood, about where the water came from, where it went to. The water is actually still here with us. It's in the ocean basins. There's enough water on the planet now. If you flatten the whole earth out, mountains pushed down, ocean basins raised up, there's enough water to cover the whole planet to nearly 3 kilometres in depth. So there's heaps of water here.
Wow.
It's just that the mountains and so on that we have now weren't there before the flood. The Earth's surface has changed a lot.
And of course, it says that in the Bible.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Now, Mike, I was reading that you've been on holidays over to places like the Grand Canyon, and you've been rafting down. Is that rafting? Is that what you were doing?
Yes, it was. It was, again, a little plug here for an amazing ministry called Canyon Ministries. They're based in Flagstaff, Arizona. So if any of your listeners are keen to go along and have a biblical view of the canyon, but rafting and hiking and so on down the canyon, I did a 9-day tour in 2014. It was absolutely fantastic, biblically based, wonderful fellowship and worship, but also science. And it's just a stunning experience to see the Grand Canyon from the bottom and see the geology, the fossils, the erosion, the layers, and have it explained from the lens of Scripture.
Yeah, now I can imagine, a giant flood creating the Grand Canyon. I've actually flown over it before. I've never rafted down it. I can imagine it would be spectacular because the walls are just so high. But what is the non-Christian view? How do they believe the Grand Canyon was created if it wasn't for a flood?
Well, the standard uniformitarian. A uniformitarian basically means the present is the key to the past. They assume that the erosion rate we see today, the rate at which mountains wear down and river beds raise up, and that sort of thing happens at the same rate, has happened for billions of years, pretty much the same as we measure today. So there's no room for catastrophe and so on. So they believe that the Colorado River slowly eroded down over millions of years, worked its way slowly down through the rock layers, creating the Grand Canyon. But that just doesn't stack up when we know how erosion works, how the amount of water that's in the canyon and so on now. It just could not ever have happened like that. And there's so much evidence that was a catastrophic flow of water very quickly over a period of just weeks or days, weeks or months that carved it out. So you had a lot of water in a short time, not a small amount of water in a long time.
Now, I think a few weeks ago we were chatting with Dr. Ron Neller in regards to water moving through mountainous regions and how it's so odd that there's so many places with big straight cliff faces on either side of the watercourse, and how naturally over time they tend to erode and become sort of angular hillsides rather than cliffs. Well, with the Grand Canyon, there's a lot of those very straight cliffs, isn't there?
There is, absolutely, and that's right. The steep-sided surfaces always erode more quickly than horizontal surfaces. And the other thing about the Grand Canyon that many of you will know if you've been there or seen it on TV or in calendars and so on, is that all the rock strata that's exposed is basically like a layer cake, layer after rock, of rock, sometimes very different, but the what they call the interface between those rock units is often absolutely billiard table flat. And those rock layers go out for hundreds of thousands of square kilometres. It's not just a local bit of rock in that area. It goes out, sometimes right across the United States and even further. And yet these layers, we're told there are millions of years of missing time between the layers, but there's no erosion. They're flat, absolutely billiard table flat. If you had, for example, the Hermit Shale, which is the red, soft mudstone, and above that's the Coconino Sandstone, one's sort of reddish and one's white, or a light tan colour, and yet there's no erosion between these layers, and it just beggars belief that you could actually have the Hermit Shale exposed to wind, rain, earthquakes and so on for 10 to 12 million years and have it still as flat as a pancake. So The erosion between the layers is gone. It just doesn't make sense to have slow and gradual over that time.
Yeah. Well, that's amazing. And I guess when you look at the Grand Canyon from inside, when you look at those layers, is there sort of any consistency as to, they're sort of all so thick, or are they all completely different, or does it get, thicker layers towards the bottom than the top, or is there completely different makeup of the layers in different areas?
Yes, the rock layers are quite different, and the thickness varies as well. And again, from a biblical point of view, we would explain the flood as being, a catastrophic event that brought in, billions of tons of water flowing from different areas. And as the currents eddied around and things changed and rose and fell, and over time, it would bring in different sediments from different areas, laying these layers down. And then it would sort of ebb back somewhat, and then more sediment would come from a different area, bringing these very different layers of rock on top of each other. So they're not uniformly thick. The thickness does vary. And then eventually you get down to the bottom, towards the bottom, and there's a thing called the Great Unconformity, which is there's different debates about what that actually marks in the biblical account, but that really goes all around the world. We have this thing called the Great Unconformity, where the rocks change at that point. And so, people think it's actually the pre-flood boundary. The rocks below that are pre-flood, but we don't know for sure. But it's really interesting seeing all those rock layers exposed so easily for great study.
Yeah, wow. And is there anyone in the Grand Canyon that's actually sort of, I guess, chopping away looking for shells or bones or anything else at different layers?
Yes, there is, though, because it's part of a national park. Fossil collection and even rock sampling is very restricted. There's actually one of the scientists, an Australian scientist, Dr. Andrew Snelling. He was our PhD geologist on board. He's very well known amongst creationist circles, a lovely guy from Australia, obviously. And he wanted to sample one particular area. The rocks are very folded. They're being contorted into a very tightly folded formation, but there's no cracking in the rock layers. So he wanted to sample that to see whether they had been heated or whether they were being folded while they were still soft and wet. But he was actually blocked for a long time by the Parks Board saying you can't do that. I think they knew what he would actually find once he studied these rocks under the microscope. Mm-hmm. Eventually they got a court injunction and he was allowed to sample, and that's been published, showing that those thick layers, many metres thick, were all folded while they were still wet. They could not be millions of years old. So, but normally most people can't just go and take things from in there, being a national park.
Yeah, wow. So is this like folded horizontally, or is it more like a vertical fold?
It's almost like a sideways fold. There's some very famous pictures. There's lots of folded rock all around the world. But yeah, basically, if you look from the side of the wall, it goes up and like a swirl, like almost like a wave shape. You know, like a breaking wave. It goes up and curls over and folds under itself. So it's like a huge multi-layered wave within the rock.
Yeah.
And that would be explained by the soft sediments after the flood. Things were still dewatering and setting slowly, and then you'd had huge uplifts and so on, twisting the rock and contorting it with big earth movements, and that would have moved the rocks and distorted them before they fully set.
Mm. Okay, of course, we can see from a biblical perspective that makes sense. How do the non-Christians, how do they believe that was formed?
Well, I think it's just often these things are, is a mystery. I haven't seen a convincing or solid answer on some of these formations about why, for example, there is no erosion. There's different ideas they try to do. Even like Dr. Neller talked about what they call the water gaps. When you have a river cut straight through a mountain range. Well, they have this idea that the mountains rose at the same rate the river was cutting downwards over millions of years. Well, that may be feasible, potentially in one or two places, but not thousands of places all around the world with these things cutting at the same rates. So they have just those stories that try to rescue the count, but they're not convincing.
Yes.
And again, we've got some great articles on water gaps, on erosions on the Grand Canyon on our creation.com site that give you some really good peer-reviewed and also quoting secular sources about these different things.
Awesome. Well, that's creation.com. If you have any questions, please send them through to us. This is Michael Cook from New Zealand talking to us right now from Creation Ministries International. And if you have any questions, please send them through to our text line 0401 949 949. Right now, we're going to listen to a bit of Jordan Feliz with a song called Next to Me, and we'll come back to Michael Cook very soon. That was Joel Vaughan, Wide Awake, here on 94.9. It is 23 minutes to 5, and we have Michael Cook on the line from New Zealand and from Creation Ministries International. He's here to answer your questions. If you have any questions, just send them through to our text line 0401 949 949. And, of course, you guys have a wonderful resource, that is creation.com. Thousands of pages of information, which is just awesome. But if anybody does have a question, whilst you can go to creation.com and there's a very good chance you will get an answer there, we'd love to hear about it on air, because if you have a question, chances are somebody else has the same question and they'd probably like to hear it answered as well. Now, Michael, we were talking about a little bit about your trip through the Grand Canyon, which was pretty exciting before. But something else that I know a lot of listeners would love to hear about is, we've all heard about natural selection. We've all heard about evolution. I mean, you can't watch too many TV shows about, nature without them talking about evolution. But what's the difference between natural selection and evolution?
That's a really good question, Mick, and one of the things that often people get confused. So when people say, what do you think about evolution, or do you believe in evolution, we have to understand what the definition of evolution is. So yes, so natural selection is a scientific fact. Animals do change, they do adapt, they do fit niches, and therefore, do better if they have certain traits. But often the examples we get for the proof for evolution is just a simple case of natural selection. For example, antibiotic resistance, or a really good example is, say, beetles living on a windy island, and a mutation occurs that causes some beetles to lose the ability to express wings. But they actually have a local advantage because they won't get blown into the sea if they take off. So over time, you'll find that population of beetles will become predominantly wingless. Have they gained anything? No. Do they have an advantage? Yes. So it's actually a downward loss of information, but it does give a local advantage. And when we see things like finch beaks, length in the Galapagos Islands, or moth colours on trees with pollution and so on, we get different environments change, and creatures that are better fitted to that environment will actually do better. But we're not getting the kind of change that will give you, microbes to man type evolution over billions of years, upward increasing complexity. So all we see is natural selection selects away from what already exists. It does not create anything new, and mutations nearly always damage and destroy information. So the change we see is not in the right direction for evolution.
On the weekend, of course, Easter weekend, it wouldn't have been right if I didn't watch a movie that had something to do with the biblical story. Now, I had a mate staying over at my place who's not a Christian, but I thought, we'll put the movie Noah on. Now, Noah, look, it's very Hollywood. They've sort of, I think they've sort of mixed that whole story up a tad just to make it sort of look better in a movie than rather than make it look real. But they showed the animals. Firstly, there was birds. Like, there was thousands and thousands and thousands of birds just flying into the ark, and then all of a sudden all these animals, and there was a lot that looked very similar, and you sort of think, okay, is that the way it would have worked, or would there have been different animals going onto the ark, as in there might have been just two cats, and maybe there were two, I don't know, lions or tigers or something, and slowly I guess they're not really evolving, as you were talking about natural selection and the little bug losing its wings. Well, they're losing information, and there's different, I guess, species within a kind. Is that how it works?
That's right. So one of the things that people who are skeptics of biblical creation would actually hold up what they call a straw man argument. They say, well, God, you creationists believe that God created all the species in the world at creation and nothing's ever changed, and so natural selection proves evolution. But you're right. The Bible is very clear that God created everything, the heavens and the earth and everything in it, in 6 ordinary days, and rested on the 7th day, and gave us our pattern for the week and for work and rest and worship. But also he talks about creating things that then reproduce after their own kind. So biblical kind is like a larger grouping of creatures, plants and animals, and within that there's lots and lots of designed variability. So God would have created them with a perfect genome, lots and lots of potential, and over time, as they spread out and populated the earth, and as things change, they would then become adapted, and therefore things would change. And so all the different creatures we have today were not created on day one during the creation week. So you're right. The ark. People say, well, how do you get millions of different creatures onto the ark? We're talking about the different kinds. So you would have had a representative of the dog kind, the cattle kind, the horse kind, the cat kind. It wouldn't have taken on a lion, a tiger, and a puma, and a cheetah, and all these sort of things, the domestic cats and so on. You would have had an original ancestor that was genetically rich and then was able to adapt to form the species we have today. And many of these creatures can actually hybridize. So a lion and a tiger can actually mate and form a hybrid called a tigon or a liger, depending on which was the father. And so see many things can actually hybridize within a kind, but you never can go outside that. And so we actually have a very clear support for the biblical idea of a perfect creation that's now declining and falling apart, and there's variability within the kind giving us the species, but you never get anything changing outside those kinds.
Yeah, wow. Now, I've often seen stories in the media and they talk about, a particular species that they thought had become extinct like 80 years ago or 100 years ago, that sort of thing. And all of a sudden they've just found a new one. They go, oh, look, we've just found a new one. And I quite often think to myself, well, did they just find another one and was it not extinct? Or maybe has the, DNA slowly broken down from another one of its kind, and it's sort of become a very similar species again to the one that had become extinct. Is that possible?
Well, it is. I think it depends on also what we define as a species, isn't it? So often they say a species has a particular characteristic that sets it aside from others, and so they becomes separated and can't reproduce with other, creatures of different species. But it's interesting, the whole thing. Sometimes you find these different species. They talk about X million species of beetles and things. Often it's down to a tiny difference in traits. One's got a slightly longer a wing, or it's got a slightly different coloration, and so they end up with these tiny differences that often are called a species. So the whole idea of species is quite flexible and variable on what they mean. But I think the key thing is that yes, creatures can what they call the morphology, basically the way that their body shape is can be expressed, and that can be dependent on the genes or on the environment to some degree. So, creatures that look similar may or may not be of the same species, but often it's very blurred on how different they are. But it's interesting how many things found in the fossil record, supposedly millions of years ago, and yet they're found still living today, like the coelacanth, the fish that were supposedly extinct 200 or so million years ago. No more fossils in the fossil record, and they're found swimming around off South Africa and also around Indonesia, and basically unchanged. So we find many examples called living fossils, which confound this idea of millions of years.
Yeah. Wow. And same thing could happen. They might have become extinct only a few hundred years ago, but then, all of a sudden, whatever their same kind is has had a bit of a change, because we know that their DNA can break down, and it could have come back to the same species.
Yes, well, it'd be hard. I guess the one supposedly extinct, and whether the one you find now was actually potentially of the same species. It's an interesting point. Actually, speaking of Australia and fossils, I think it's pronounced the Wallamai pine they found a number of years ago. Remember that the pine tree they found, I think, in the Blue Mountains or somewhere? Yep. And they said, this has been extinct for millions of years. And they found this small grove of these things and started to clone them and sell them off as fossil, these remnants from the dinosaur era or something. They were selling them off as special, trees being brought back from the grave, so to speak. So a lot of hype around some of these things that are supposedly very old.
Yes. Now, we talk about kinds and species, and they're very similar. Obviously, species come from a kind. Will we see a lot more species going into the future?
I think so, yes. As things become more diverse, over time, and also as things break down, yes, you'll end up with more and more species, I guess, over time. That's what you would expect from a biblical and scientific point of view, that if you have a rich genetic heritage that's becoming thinned out, it's going to end up with more and more variability when you look at the creatures. But that, of course, eventually ends up with being able to go no further. And what we like to use is a really good example that people can understand is dog. The dog kind, I guess, dog breeding. So you think of all the different dogs we have today, from the wild kinds, the coyotes and the hunting dogs and huskies and so on, right through to domestic dogs, from Chihuahuas to Great Danes and boxers and so on. They all came from an original wolf-like ancestor just a few thousand years ago.
Yep.
Genetically rich, erect ears, a long tail, medium-length fur, medium size, and those creatures had enough potential in their DNA to be expressed into a Great Dane and a Chihuahua with enough selection, either artificial breeding or natural selection, over time. But the key thing is here, if you think of how much change there is in the dog kind, but if something happened and wiped out all the dogs in the world except for Chihuahuas, there's no way you can go back to anything else, because you've lost so many other traits. Selection takes away, destroys things. So the Chihuahua is basically almost on the outer extreme of what can change. It can't go much further. Same with the Great Dane. You've lost all the genes for shortness and smallness and that sort of thing. So, when we see even plants and fruits and so on, you end up with different traits being expressed, but you're losing something. That's why they so desperately hang on to all the wild kinds of fruits and seeds and so on, don't they, in these seed banks, because they need to hang on to the varieties.
Mm. Wow.
Yeah.
So I guess they've got to try and hang on to the original variety, the earliest.
I also encourage your listeners to just go on our website, creation.com, and have a look at there's a thing called genetic entropy, which means basically it's like rust in your car. Each generation, as we have children and animals have offspring and plants even, each generation is slightly more damaged than the one before. And so these accumulation over time build up like rust in your car. You don't notice your car rusting from one day to the next, but over time, same with our genomes, we're getting more and more degraded and more genetic diseases are occurring because our genome is just falling apart.
Yeah.
And natural selection and so on it slows down the damage, the effects of the damage, but it cannot eliminate it. Because most changes are too small for natural selection to remove, so they build up. And it's a major problem for evolution because we're degrading, we're devolving.
Yeah, it's almost proof that evolution didn't exist.
Well, strong evidence that that's the case.
Yes. Wow, that's awesome. Well, Michael, I thank you so much for another awesome week. And of course, it's so important that people, I guess, believe what's written in the Bible. Everything in the Bible is accurate, right?
Well, I believe so. It's inspired by the Holy Spirit, through human authors, yes, but it talks in Timothy about all Scripture is God breathed and useful, right through for instruction and correction and so on. So I really encourage your listeners. It's obviously the science is interesting, but it's all about a relationship with our Creator and knowing that we can trust His user guide, His manual for life. That He shows the history of the world, about His character, and of course points to Jesus and gives us a hope in a future that the world cannot give. So just you can trust God's word and put your trust in Jesus, who is the Creator and the Saviour.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Michael. I believe we're going to be speaking with you again next week. So if anybody does have any questions for Michael, please send them through to the text line. Just SMS 0401 949 949. Thank you again, Michael.
Right. And one last very quick in closing. Next week I'm going to be in Queenstown, actually, in the South Island. I'm at a hydrological conference, and so I'll be able to slip away and have a talk to you all. But looking forward to catching up next week.
Awesome. Okay. Thank you, Michael.
Okay. Thanks,
Cheers.
Matt. Okay. Bye, everyone.